countries freely, but to do business in China, you have to follow their rules, which are quite restrictive, then those positions are not conducive to a global economy. I don't know whether we're in a trade war or not. I know you know, and I believe the president knows, that the only way to win a trade war is don't fight the thing. Having said that, this is more than just trade. This is about, I don't want to overstate this, but this is about the future of the global economy. And I would encourage you, Mr. Secretary, for what my opinion is worth, is do the right thing, hang tough. You know, with the end objective being, we emerge out of this with friends with China, friendly competitors, but with a set of rules that we're all going to abide by. I'd like the thoughts, to the extent you can share them with us, about where we are in the negotiations and the potential, if we can confect this arrangement to the American economy, if we could open up China to American businesses.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your thoughtful comments. I have been involved in these discussions with President Trump for almost the last 2 years now. From the original meeting at Mar-a-Lago with President Trump and President Xi, there was an acknowledgement that we needed to rebalance the trade relationship, that it was too far in one direction. Our economy was open to them, and their economy was not open to us. So under the direction of both presidents, we started working on rebalancing the relationship. More recently, I would say, since December of this year, I have been working very closely with Ambassador Lighthizer. I think we're in the 11th round of discussions. As I said several weeks ago, I thought we were very close to a historic agreement with China that would be good for us and good for them. If we can open up markets and compete fairly, I think this is one of the biggest opportunities for American workers and American companies. So we have been working hard on this. As I've said, this is a very detailed agreement. It has 7 chapters dealing with lots of different issues. We've had the interagency from all the departments involved in this. I think, as you know, Ambassador Lighthizer and I gave a press conference a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago now, that things had gone in a different direction. I think we had a constructive meeting with the Vice Premier, and that he came here. We're continuing discussions. There's still a lot of work to do, but I can assure you that President Trump is determined that we have free and fair trade and wants to have a fair relationship with rules that we can compete fairly. As I've said, my expectation is we will most likely go to Beijing at some point in the near future to continue those discussions, and I think it's President Trump's expectation to meet with President Xi at the G20 at the end of June. So the President has put in place tariffs to use that in a way to create a fair and a fair agreement.
I'm going, thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'll save my other questions until my colleagues have a chance to weigh in. Senator Coons, would you like to make an opening statement and start your question, sir? And then we'll go to Senator Van Hollen, if that's okay.
Thank you, Chairman Kennedy. Thank you for your graciousness and understanding. I was at a Police Week event, and Mr. Secretary, apologize for being late to the opening of the hearing. I just appreciate the opportunity for us to continue to work on this subcommittee, Mr. Chairman, on the wide range of things that we have before us. The Department of the Treasury, the IRS in particular, takes up the lion's share of this subcommittee's budget and responsibility. So I'm grateful for your time, Mr. Secretary, and for the IRS Commissioner who will be before us soon.
Thanks, man.
I'm pleased that you request an increase in funding for the Office of Terrorism Financial Intelligence, which has the critical responsibility of enforcing sanctions. I just led a delegation to East Asia and had a chance to discuss the challenge we face from North Korea with our allies in Japan and South Korea. Sanctions are a critical security diplomatic tool, but they only work if they're enforced. I'm also glad you requested additional resources for IRS enforcement activities, but I'm concerned that that request is predicated on an adjustment to our allocation and want to talk with you about how we work through that. I also think you obviously face a significant challenge in terms of badly outdated IT systems. If I understand correctly, some of your core systems are written in COBOL, something that is as old as I am, and these systems are both expensive and difficult to maintain. So I have a few questions on that. I am, of course, disappointed your budget proposes to eliminate grants to community development finance institutions which support development and create jobs in underserved neighborhoods, and I will question you about that. I also, frankly, am concerned about the overall adequacy of the budget for the IRS. We'll take that up with the Commissioner. But you are still $1 billion below the budget for 2010, and I'm concerned about responsiveness and service levels. All of us have constituents who spend long periods of time trying to get someone on the phone or trying to get responsiveness. That is no disrespect to the professionalism of the folks at Treasury or IRS in particular. It's just that I think we have understaffed and under-resourced the IRS. So I very much look forward to hearing your testimony and appreciate, Mr. Chairman, your welcoming my opening statement. Let me ask just two questions, if I could, Mr. Secretary. First, as you know, charitable giving is something that's been a concern of mine. Senator Lankford and I have tried to address what may well be a significant drop in charitable giving. 37 million taxpayers had access to itemized charitable deduction giving prior to the enactment of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Today, only 16 million will likely itemize their deductions and get a financial incentive to contribute to charity. I'm concerned we may see a significant drop in giving to houses of worship, to other NGOs and community charities. We talked about this at last year's hearing, and I've written to you. Now the first year's tax filings are coming in or complete. Are you doing an analysis of the impact of the TCJA on charitable giving? And what data will you be giving this committee or the public about the impact on charitable giving?
So, Mr. Senator, thank you very much. And first of all, I would just comment, I appreciate your comments on the IRS. I shortened my opening statement, but I would like to just highlight the IRS modernization and technology is our single biggest priority. For too long, we've underinvested in this technology. I think this is critical to everything we do. Customer service, last year we had a technology problem on tax day, so this is an investment that's very important for taxpayers. In regards to your question on charitable contributions, first let me just say, I too and the administration very much believes in charitable giving. This is an important part of our community and our society. Given the old technology that we have, I tried to get information in advance of today to try to be responsive to you on this. It's too early for us to tell what the impact was. I am obviously hopeful that charitable giving did not go down, and I would hope within the next few months, as we have in all the data and we crunch it, we can be responsive to you and publicly talk about this.
But
again, this is one of these things, if we had modernized technology, we'd be able to cue the system and get this real time.
I think this is something about which I've heard very broadly from community organizations, houses of worship in Delaware, and I hope we can stay in regular touch about it. I think it is a likely unintended consequence of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, but it could be a really significant one. In February, you notified Congress you intended to transfer up to $600 million of the Treasury forfeiture fund to Homeland Security for border wall construction. Historically, you've used accumulated surpluses in that fund to augment resources for federal law enforcement partners supporting cybersecurity or cybercrime operations at the IRS or elsewhere, or Coast Guard equipment for searching drugs on ships at sea. These are two recent examples. What law enforcement activities might have gone funded had you not diverted the $600 million to wall construction?
So thank you for that question. First, let me just say, as you've outlined, the forfeiture fund has been used in the past regularly for enforcement purposes. We did have a request from DHS to transfer money to them for enforcement purposes. DHS made the decision to allocate that money to the wall, and we send money over as they have specific things. I think, as you're aware of, there's always lots of good requests for this money, and I'm not aware of specifically what the other uses would have been, but I acknowledge there are always good uses for funds, and this was the priority of DHS.
Well, I'll tell you, the law enforcement leaders I just heard from have a lot of pressing communications and security needs I think would perhaps have been better served there. Let me last ask you about the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund, or CDFI. Your budget proposes a cut of $236 million from last year's enacted level, and says in justification, the CDFI industry has matured and these institutions should have access to private capital needed to build capacity, extend credit, provide financial services to the communities they serve. My understanding from a number of CDFIs, and there's 5 that operate in Delaware, is that their ability to raise private sector investment is greatly enhanced by funding of the CDFI Financial Assistance Fund and their awards, and the availability of those awards have made it possible for CDFIs to finance projects and businesses in some of the most rural or most under-resourced communities in America. Has the department reached out to the organizations and institutions whose capital is leveraged by CDFIs with financial assistance awards to gauge their willingness to actually continue working with CDFIs in the absence of this federal funding? This would almost completely shut them down in terms of their federal support, and I frankly have difficulty with the credibility of the justification that they do not need federal support, given what I've heard from the CDFI community.
Well, let me just comment that we had to make difficult decisions within a large budget where we were trying to be constrained on overall spending. So this was a relative decision of different priorities. Let me acknowledge that we do think that the industry is mature, but on the other hand, if the committee supports this program and thinks that there should be additional money to be funded to it, we would acknowledge that it does serve valid purposes in many communities, and we would continue to move forward with these funds. So this was a relative decision where there are lots of important priorities within the department.
I appreciate that answer. I'll just say that this strikes me as a community that has a long record of leveraging significant multiples, and they most directly benefit the least wealthy or resourced communities in America. And given some of the choices made in the tax bill, this struck me as a particularly hard choice to accept. That's part of our role in oversight. I appreciate your answer and the opportunity to work together. Mr. Chairman, I hope we will restore funding for the community development financial institutions. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. And I share Senator Coons's concerns about the proposed elimination of CDFI. I also want to thank you and your team at the Secretary in the Department of Treasury for working to enforce the North Korea sanctions. As you know, Senator Toomey and I think we should go farther. We've proposed the Brink Act again for secondary sanctions and look forward to that conversation with you. Secretary, I have some questions about taxpayer accountability. We have a president who's bragged about not paying taxes. When he ran for president, he said, quote, "That makes me smart," unquote. Just a week ago, the president tweeted that some of the write-offs he claims were, quote, a tax shelter. That's his words. He said, quote, "It was sport." So, Mr. Secretary, wouldn't you agree that Congress has an interest in verifying that the IRS is fairly enforcing the law and making sure that the president, who is in charge of the executive branch, making sure that the president is paying the taxes he owes?
We have communicated that if Congress wants to sit down with us or representatives specifically of Ways and Means, we've said that to the extent that Congress wants to understand how the president is audited or the vice president is audited, there are policies and procedures.
Mr. Secretary, with all respect, that wasn't my question.
I'm sorry,
question
that I misinterpreted. I didn't mean to.
My question relates to whether or not you agree that Congress has a legitimate interest in itself verifying that the president has paid the taxes due and owing.
Again, what I would say, and where I was going to go on this, is that I think Congress has a legitimate interest to make sure that the IRS is performing the function properly as it relates to any taxpayer. If you're referring to the specific request of the president's returns, I think, as you know, I've said before, I think this is a very important issue that has a precedent way beyond any one president in Congress, affects the weaponization of the IRS and could be used against anyone. And we, on this request, we have carefully reviewed this with the Department of Justice and will be responding.
Mr. Secretary, you haven't answered my question as to whether or not Congress has a legitimate interest in verifying whether the IRS is properly enforcing the tax law with respect to the president. Are you aware that Section 6103 of the IRS was first enacted because of congressional concern that a senior member of a former president's administration, member of President Harding's administration, was being given special treatment by what was then called the Bureau of Internal Revenue? Are you aware of that fact?
I am.
Okay. So Congress clearly was not convinced that the Bureau of Internal Revenue was providing them full information about tax payments due and owing by a senior member of the Harding administration, and that's why they passed the law to begin with, so that they could independently verify that. Isn't that the case?
I'm not sure if that's the case or not.
Well, let me give you some additional history. There were allegations that President Nixon had not paid the taxes he owed, and in 1973, President Nixon famously said, quote, "People have got to know whether or not their president is a crook." Nixon said that he had paid all the taxes he owed. Nixon also said the IRS had signed off on his returns. And it was true that the IRS had signed off on President Nixon's returns. But it turned out that Nixon was not paying the taxes due and owing. And we only learned about that when the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation, not the IRS, determined that Nixon owed over $400,000 in taxes. So, Mr. Secretary, I ask you again, given that history, doesn't Congress, as a separate branch of government, have an interest, a legitimate interest, in determining whether or not the IRS is enforcing the tax laws with respect to a president of the United States?
Mr. Senator, I want to be respectful in answering this, and I'm not trying to avoid your question, but the answer is that there is a difference in interpretation between Congress and us and the Department of Justice around this law that not only impacts this president and this Congress, but has a very big impact on every single taxpayer and weaponizing the IRS. And this is why there are three branches of government. So if there is a difference of opinion, this will go to the third branch of government to be resolved.
Well, just to finish up, if I could, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I read the letter that you sent, the long letter and memo of first your letter of May 6th and then April 23rd. And in there, you do not appear to challenge the fact that Congress would have a legitimate interest in determining whether or not the IRS had properly enforced the law. And that is the issue, the tax law before us right now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. But before I call on Senator Daines, I want to exercise my prerogative to ask one question. I followed Chris's line of questioning very carefully, and as usual, he asked very incisive questions. But legitimate interest. Do you think we should have a precedent, to put this in real world terms, and I'll put it in personal terms. Let's say I'm interested in the IRS, and I'm interested in what kind of job it's doing. So I think I'd like to see, as a United States Senator, some tax returns. Let me think. How about you send me all the tax returns from every candidate among my Democratic friends running for President of the United States? Now, I'm not interested in it for political reasons. I just want to study the IRS, and I think I'll start with these returns. How much confidence do you think the American people will have in the Internal Revenue Service and the privacy concerns if we start doing that in this country?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think it would be very dangerous to provide you with those returns. I think it would also be very dangerous to provide you with returns of large Democrats or Republicans who make political gifts, or leaders of industry, or leaders of labor unions. Again, our concern is, and the Nixon administration did try to weaponize the IRS. So, as I've said, this is an unprecedented issue. It's a very complicated issue. I take very seriously my obligation to follow the law, and that is why I consulted with the Department of Justice, and we will proceed on what is a very important issue to the American taxpayers.
Senator Daines.
Mr. Chairman, not now, but I hope, given that exchange, I'll have an opportunity to follow up.
Absolutely, Senator. Senator Daines.
Thank you, Chairman Kennedy, Ranking Member Coons. Thank you, Secretary MNUCHIN, for being here today. I sincerely applaud your efforts and thank you for holding China accountable. I've said the only thing worse than doing something is doing nothing. And having spent 5.5 years on the ground working there in Guangzhou years ago as an expat for Procter & Gamble, having managed the Asia-Pacific region for 5 years for a cloud computing company, I have a lot of experience of what it's like to do business on the ground there in that part of the world. But I will tell you, we need results. I think we need them soon. As I travel around the state of Montana, I continue to hear the concerns from our farmers and ranchers. For perspective, our #1 economic driver in Montana is agriculture. We're very dependent on exports. In fact, 70 to 80% of our wheat crop goes to Asia. I'm also hearing concerns from folks being impacted by tariffs and uncertainty outside of Montana ag, including businesses that make up Montana's outdoor industry, which is about a $7 billion outdoor economy. In fact, one of those is Sims. In fact, they're right there in my hometown of Bozeman. To maximize the effectiveness of the administration's efforts and to reach a resolution to this dispute as quickly as possible, I do believe it's critical that we work with our allies in a multilateral fashion to confront their trade abuses, talking about China's trade abuses, and increase pressure on China. I think we need to take and make whatever structural reforms are necessary to level this playing field for Montana farmers, for Montana ranchers, for the outdoor industry, and for other businesses. The question, Mr. Secretary, is how are you coordinating with our allies in the region and around the world such that we have a united and strategic approach to countering the abuses that China continues to make as it relates to forced technology transfer, intellectual property theft, open violations of WTO?
Well, Mr. Senator, first let me say I really do appreciate I've had the opportunity to talk to you about this many times, and I think your firsthand experience having been there and understanding P&G has been very helpful for me as we look at this. And as I said earlier, if we can get the proper deal, which would be a good deal for the United States, it would be a big opportunity for the P&Gs of the world and our American workers and American companies to open up their market on a fair and level playing field. Although we are conducting these discussions on a bilateral basis, I can assure you I am in constant touch with the finance ministers of the G7 in keeping them up to date. I will be traveling to the G20 finance ministers in June, and we'll be having a separate meeting with the G7, and I will update them on the process there. So although this is something that we are in bilateral discussions, I can assure you we are working with our allies. And let me just comment, I like Bozeman a lot. It's a lovely place. I've enjoyed the opportunity to visit.
And if you fly fish, you want to make sure you have a pair of Sims waders. They're the only waders left that are made in America. The rest are all made overseas. They're made in America.
I can assure you, I'm not very good at fly fishing, but I do enjoy it.
And thank you. And by the way, Mr. Chairman, they're actually made in Bozeman, Montana as well. That's right there. No, they're great waders. The problem they have is they're such high quality, you only need one pair for your life, so you never have to replace them. They're wonderful. Anyway, thank you. I want to shift gears here and talk about polysilicon. I raised this important issue with you in a separate hearing in March. As you know, the U.S. polysilicon has long been targeted by retaliatory tariffs by China, in part due to its Made in 2025 agenda, and these tariffs are threatening hundreds of high-wage manufacturing jobs at REC Silicon in Butte, Montana. It's critical that REC Silicon, one of the largest employers in the area, good jobs, and these other polysilicon manufacturers are able to compete truly on a level playing field. Secretary Mnuchin, is removing these tariffs on U.S. polysilicon a priority for you, and will you work to ensure that they stay on the agenda as negotiations with China continue?
Yes, I can assure you they are, and I appreciate, I've received your letter, and I've worked with Ambassador Lighthizer, and we will continue to make this a priority.
Lastly, as you know, China is rapidly developing its own innovative ecosystem. In fact, Senator Kennedy has been over there with me touring China. It's competing or even leading in critical technologies such as quantum computing or 5G. I think we need a multi-pronged approach that we can run faster. We need to go more quickly here in innovation and innovate, but the fight and the outright theft of American IP and forced technology transfers policy that China's implemented certainly compromise that outcome. In response to recent reports of China reneging on its commitments, what are your current priorities to include in any agreement to create an effective deterrent to the multitude of IP abuses with China?
Well, the issues around intellectual property, forced technology transfer, and other issues are some of the most important issues that Ambassador Lighthizer and I have been dealing with. We made a lot of progress on those issues in a potential agreement. I think, as you know, we're trying to continue to move forward on that basis. And I agree with you. American technology is important. We appreciate Congress's work on FIRMA and us being able to protect it. And, you know, I have great confidence in the U.S. and European consortiums on 5G and their leadership in the world.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Secretary, I have a couple more questions, and I'm going to leave plenty of time here for everybody. First, before I forget, I sit on the Banking Committee, and have had the pleasure of hearing Chairman Powell testify a number of times, and I know you recommended him for service at this level, and I wanted to thank you for that. I just think he's very level-headed, very objective, and I've really learned a lot from listening to him. Let me shift gears. You mentioned the IT Modernization Plan, and I know that we're going to ask the Commissioner about this, but obviously this is within your purview, and you have a deep background in IT, which I appreciate. But the IRS has a deep background too, but its background is checkered in terms of modernizing its computer system. We've thrown a lot of money down a rat hole. Now, I understand the IRS wants to embark on yet another venture. I understand they've got an outside group, McKinsey, pretty good group, that says they're on the right track. I also understand that this history of problems with computer modernization and technological modernization at IRS predates you. So you didn't father this child, but you got to raise it. And I want to hear your thoughts. Why should we believe that it's going to work this time when it hasn't worked ever in the past after spending hundreds of millions of dollars?
Well, I'm not an expert, and I can't really comment why it hasn't worked on the past. I can comment on what our plan is here, and I personally have had a lot of experience in the technology sector. I was the Chief Information Officer of Goldman Sachs, so I understand these areas, and I've dedicated a significant amount of time over the last year to work with the IRS on this. What I can assure you is, and that there is no question, the IRS has very old technology and does not provide taxpayers with the service that they should expect in this day and age. Whether it's being able to access information real time on the internet, whether it's customer service, whether it's being able to schedule callbacks, whether it's being able to do chats online, taxpayers deserve to be able to communicate effectively with the IRS in all means. I will also tell you that the IRS faces a challenge that many big companies have with legacy technology, and that it's hard to keep running and change at the same time. When you build things from scratch and you're a new business, it's easy to start them. But when you are managing one of the largest IT operations in the world, it is hard to balance the priorities of maintaining the system and investing in the future. I would leave this committee with, if there's anything we could hopefully agree on a bipartisan basis, is there is a need to invest in the technology. There is a need to make a long-term commitment. We can't build IT modernization if we don't know there is long-term money. This is not something that's going to be built in any 1 or 2 years.
But you're sold on this effort.
I am sold on this effort, and this is at least a 6-year effort. The reason why we have a 6-year plan and not a 5-year plan, most people have 5-year plans, we couldn't deliver this in McKinsey.
I want to stay within the rules, Mr. Secretary. Let me shift gears right quick. I'm not trying to trick you. Do you know what a deemed export license is?
I'm not an expert on it, but I have some familiarity with it.
Well, it's basically a license to share technology with somebody. We welcome students from all over the world to come to our universities. We've got the greatest universities in the history of the world. I'm not saying there aren't good universities in other countries, but the higher education system in America is the best in the world. Sometimes we have problems with funding, but the quality you can't argue with. And a lot of foreign students want to come here. And some of them have access to our technology. And some of them take it back to their country. And sometimes that hurts America. And sometimes that hurts American security. I've got a bill, S-937, called Protecting American Technology Act. It will require the Department of Commerce to require a deemed export license to be in place before foreign nationals can conduct scientific research and have access to some of this technology. I think we can do a better job. I'm not going to ask you to support it here because I know I'm catching you blind, but I wish you'd take a look at it. I want foreign students to come to America. I want them to be our friends, but I don't want to tempt anybody to steal our technology, and I think we can do a better job. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Kennedy. Mr. Secretary, a bipartisan group of senators worked a couple of years ago to extend a critical tax credit for emerging clean energy technologies. This includes carbon capture and sequestration. I'm talking about 45Q. And there's companies and investors waiting for guidance from your department so they can rely on the credit and deploy new technologies. Some interim guidance would be helpful. Do you have any timeline for when there will be guidance available for this critical tax credit?
Yes, I can tell you that is a priority of ours. We are working on it as we speak, so I would hope that we have interim guidance out shortly. And I have personally been on calls recently within the last few weeks in no preparation for this, specifically on this with some of the large CEOs and very detailed things. So we're taking advice. We'll then put it out. We'll take comments. But I share your view. This is very important, and we are taking it very seriously, and I hope that we get it out soon.
I think we have promising technologies in a number of areas that we ought to be racing to deploy. I recently led a delegation to East Asia, went to Japan, South Korea, China, Taiwan, met with the the finance minister, as well as the foreign minister of Japan. I want to follow up on Senator Daines' question to you about what we're doing to coordinate with our allies. I agree with the objective of challenging China's innovation mercantilism. I'm concerned about the impact on our bilateral relations and our ability to mobilize our allies of having Section 232 justified tariffs in place against vital and close allies like Canada or South Korea, where I think it is hard to explain how they are a national security threat. And both privately and publicly, the strong impression I've gotten is that it is straining our relations, not just trade, but security. Is there a timeline for relieving the steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada or South Korea, given that by all measures they've worked with us on the administration's identified trade objectives?
I can assure you that Canada and Mexico are the priority. Ambassador Lighthizer is in active discussions. The President has instructed us to try to figure out a solution, and this is a very important part of passing USMCA, which is a very important economic agreement for two of our largest trading partners. So I think we are close to an understanding with Mexico and Canada. I've spoken to the finance ministers. Ambassador Lighthizer is leading the effort on this, but I can assure you it is a priority of ours. South Korea, I think, I have not heard that South Korea is as big of an issue, but again, I can assure you we are working very closely with South Korea and Japan on the North Korea sanctioned issues, and that is our priority with them.
We recently read that the Department of Justice took possession of a North Korean ship used to illegally export coal from North Korea to China and Russia. On the issue of enforcing the sanctions against the DPRK, can you discuss whether China and Russia are actually abiding by the UN and our secondary sanctions against North Korea? Are they part of the problem? Where are we in terms of getting them to actually be good partners in enforcing sanctions on North Korea?
I think they are broadly being helpful in enforcing sanctions. That's not to say that there aren't specific circumstances, and where there are specific circumstances, we're having conversations with both of them. And to the extent they don't enforce it, we will put sanctions on specific companies. But I mean, I can tell you I was personally involved in the discussions with the Chinese to get them to move forward with us on the UN sanctions, which have been critical. And I can tell you as recently as my last trip to Beijing, in conversations with the Vice Premier and others, North Korea was high on the list.
And just again on the steel sanctions, I've heard from national leaders from Sweden to South Africa of countries that are allies and partners in other ways, but where there's no demonstration that they are a country of transshipment of Chinese steel. And they felt, I think understandably, aggrieved by the imposition of sanctions that had an impact on their economies, but was not clearly part of a coordinated effort targeted on the Chinese. I agree with the effort to go after Chinese innovation mercantilism. I'm just gravely concerned about its impact on some of our countries that we enjoy positive and long-term relations with. I understand that in the case of Canada and Mexico, the MCA is the critical focus, but now over more than a year, I hear the same concerns from soybean farmers in Delaware that Senator Daines cited from wheat farmers in Montana about the urgency of getting this done. I just think we need to engage our allies. Let me ask you a last question about your decision not to comply with a request from the Chairman of Ways and Means to provide the President's tax returns. My understanding is that Section 6103 of the Tax Code says the Treasury Secretary shall furnish such committee with any return or return information specified in a request. And I just want to know, this has historically been a function delegated to the IRS Commissioner. Was there a reason you didn't trust the IRS Commissioner to handle this? Was there a meeting between IRS and Treasury leaders directing the IRS to stand aside or stand down on this? And have you discussed Chairman Neal's request with the President or anyone in the White House, and did you get any direction on how to handle this matter from the President?
So let me start with your last question first. I have not discussed this with the President or anybody in the White House. Again, I just want to clarify one of the things I publicly said earlier is with our legal department originally, early on in this process, before we received any request, did have a discussion, but it was not to seek guidance or anything else, and that was way before we received any request, and that was just in the legal department. I have not had any discussions with the President or taken any direction from him or anybody else in the White House on this issue. Now, on the other issue, and again, I appreciate your question, so I'm happy to answer it very clearly, which is, again, I have a responsibility to supervise the IRS Commissioner and the IRS. Notwithstanding certain functions that I have delegated on a day-to-day basis, I have a responsibility, and I take that responsibility seriously as it relates to any taxpayer. And I have had many conversations with our legal department and the IRS's legal department to make sure that we are interpreting these issues correctly. Now, notwithstanding the delegation and my responsibility to supervise, I have had multiple conversations with the commissioner and with our legal department and the legal department at the IRS on these issues. The commissioner, and you're happy to ask him, and he can testify on this, has independently concurred with my decisions. So notwithstanding the delegation and notwithstanding the issue of if we didn't agree, he has specifically sent notices to Ways and Means concurring with my decision.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate your answer. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thanks for being here. Let me talk through some budget issues and some issues that really affect the American people and long-term our safety and security as a nation. Talk to me a little bit about the request that you put in for tariff financing and tracking tariff financing and some of the work that has already happened with Treasury on trying to identify the financing of both drug cartels that are moving money and drugs in and out of our country, and also tariff financing networks.
So let me just comment, I very much appreciate the support that we've had from Congress to increase funding for our TFI area for every year that I've been here, and we've grown it considerably, and I think there's never been a time when these tools are as important throughout the world. So literally every region we look at the world, we use these tools. We have regular communications. I meet it normally weekly or speak to Secretary Pompeo weekly. These are important tools to be used for all of our national security and foreign policy. So we have a coordinated effort between the intelligence community, DOD, Secretary of State, and ourselves. And I think specifically in your question, in drug cartels and others, in Mexico and other countries, we've used these tools very successfully. We will continue to use these tools very successfully. And we are determined to make sure that sources of illegal funding for these bad activities are shut off. I would also just comment that we're also looking at these as it relates to cyber currencies or cyber assets. We've recently put out guidelines on this. I've had conversations at the G20 about this. This is not only just monitoring US dollars, but we will very much enforce and carefully make sure that these crypto assets cannot be used for illicit means as well.
Thank you. We would encourage you to stay on that. That's one of the areas that, as a committee, we've focused in on for several years. As you've mentioned, that we've increased funding. This FSGG committee has been very aggressive to be able to make sure that you had the resources you needed. If you don't have what you need to be able to come back and tell us. Obviously, we'll want to know the details of the what and the where on that to be able to know what is needed. But that is a clear area that we need to be able to deal with terrorism and drug movement into our country.
Thank you for your support. We appreciate that. Again, this has been an area of great bipartisan work.
Another area that we brought up, and it came up out of this committee in some conversation in the past, is for the IRS and OIRA and regulatory issues to try to make sure that there is some cooperation between those two. Treasury and OIRA has had a memorandum of understanding to be able to go through the regulatory process. My question to you is, that's now been in place for a year. How is it going? Have there been any hiccups in that process between Treasury, IRS, and the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs?
I'd say generally it's going well. I think, we reached an agreement with OIRA, and we respect there are certain things that should be reviewed. Obviously, anytime we change these procedures, there are certain things, obviously, we wish would go a little bit faster, and we'll continue to work closely with OIRA on this to make sure that it doesn't slow down issues for taxpayers. But it's something we have a good working relationship on.
Great. You and I have talked before about opportunity zones and the regs that Treasury has put out for that. That is exceptionally helpful. Thank you for continuing to be able to get those out. There is still an unanswered question that's hanging out there that we've talked about before, and that is if an activity is illegal in federal law, can you apply and get an opportunity zone credit for that economic activity in a state? Specifically, this would apply in many states to marijuana businesses. So the question is, if a marijuana business tries to say they want to get an opportunity zone tax credit, it's illegal in federal law, but it's maybe legal in a particular state. Has that been clarified yet in federal policy? And my suggestion is, what is illegal in the federal government, we should not give a federal tax credit for. If you want my personal opinion on that, but I think this is an area that hasn't been clarified yet by Treasury.
Yeah, so I appreciate you bringing that up. So first, let me comment. We obviously have a conflict in certain states.
I've noticed.
More broadly between federal law and state law, and that creates significant problems for us at Treasury, particularly in areas of the IRS and other areas where we need to collect taxes, and we have to build cash rooms and everything else, and this has become a cash business. So without me making a policy view on this, I would encourage Congress that this is an issue that needs to be addressed because it has created issues. Specifically, in regards to your question, and we have not yet put out guidance, so I will defer to my team, but my recommendation to them would be that it is not the intent of the opportunity zones, that if there is this conflict that has not been cleared, that for now that we should not have those businesses in the opportunity zones, but I defer to my group to put out guidance on this. But I would just emphasize the broader issue is an issue that impacts us in many ways, that is an issue for Congress to look at.
Great. Mr. Secretary, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, just in response to the comments you made, I want to point out, and the Secretary acknowledged this in his response, that Section 6103 of the IRS Code was originally enacted because of congressional concerns that a senior member of the executive branch was not paying taxes. And in that case, it was the Secretary of Treasury. Congress was concerned that the Secretary of Treasury at the time, who oversaw the Bureau of Internal Revenue, was not paying taxes due and owing. And that was the motivation for passing this law. And logic tells you it would apply equally to the boss of the Secretary of Treasury. So the concern was that the IRS within the executive branch may not properly enforce the tax laws of the United States against senior members of the executive branch. And that is the legislative history of this. Secretary MNUCHIN, Senator Coons asked you about your conversations, and I think you testified that you did have conversations with counsel at the IRS. Is that right?
Yes, but before I just want to clarify one thing on this. So I acknowledge that that's what you said the history of the law was. I've also acknowledged that I've read certain things, but I am not an expert at interpreting what Congress's intent was in passing this law originally. So I just wanted to clarify that on that.
I'll let the record speak for itself there.
Thank you. Yes, I have had conversations with the commissioner and our legal counsel and their legal counsel jointly, as I would expect you think I would.
No, I'm not questioning the conversations. My question is, did the IRS Chief Counsel, Michael Desmond, agree with the decision to refuse to hand over the President's tax returns in response to Chairman Neal's request?
Again, any comments that we would have with counsel, I don't want to make a comment on what my counsel said, or I speak for their counsel. But yes, my understanding is that is the case, and that the IRS commissioner relied upon that advice as I relied upon advice from my counsel. So I believe that's the case.
Did you have a conversation with the chief counsel at the IRS?
Again, I've had conversations with the four of us on the phone, yes, and I've never heard anything that the chief counsel thought otherwise.
All right, Mr. Secretary, after it was learned that President Nixon had not paid the taxes due and owing, despite the fact that the IRS had reviewed those tax returns, the IRS began to require an automatic audit of the tax returns of the President of the United States.
You want to go next?
My question is this: if a person becomes president, while they are being audited for tax returns from earlier years, does the IRS's automatic presidential audit procedure also include the prior year tax returns as part of that audit?
I don't know the answer to that, but I can look into it. I do know that the audit requirements are the current years, but I'd be happy to look into that issue and get back to you.
I think the fact that it's difficult for you to answer that question, again, underscores the congressional concern about whether or not the tax laws are being fairly applied. Let me ask you this. Does the automatic IRS audit include a review of all of a president's underlying business enterprises?
Again, since the president has publicly commented that he was under audit for prior years, that was not an issue that I needed to look into. As it relates to the specifics of the audit requirements, again, I would be happy in a smaller, non-public setting to go through with the appropriate congressional members what exactly the audit procedures are. I would also just comment on this issue, and I know there's a lot of interest in both sides on this issue. Again, I think it's an important issue that impacts everybody. And if this issue goes through the courts, I think it's better that we have the court's interpretation, if there is a difference, than establish a precedent that is weaponizing the IRS.
With respect, Mr. Secretary, the automatic audit procedure that was established with respect to a president of the United States. That was the concern that led to that. Isn't that the case?
And the vice president,
right.
I might add.
Okay, fair enough. So that audit procedure wasn't set up for anybody, any elected official, any citizen. It was express concern about the President of the United States, because the President, of course, is in charge of the executive branch, which ultimately oversees the IRS. This is part of the manuals. It's a matter of public interest as to whether or not that special audit procedure includes a review of a president's business enterprises. That seems to me, Mr. Secretary, something that should be answered in public. I'm not asking about any particular president at this point in time. I'm asking what is the process of the IRS with respect to the automatic audit of a president?
Again, I've reviewed the process of the audit and how it works and everything else. I'd be more than happy, the specific question.
This is a question. You have a manual. It's a public manual. And I'm asking you, because it's not clear in the public manual, whether or not a president's business enterprises are part of that automatic audit. Yes or no?
And again, I've told you that I'm going to look into that and get back to you.
Oh, so you don't know as of today?
Again, we have been focused on, okay, the procedures, and I think you appreciate it's my obligation not to interfere in any individual's taxes, that the procedures we have followed, and the very specific question that you've answered, I said I'd get back to you on.
Well, it underscores the reason Congress originally wanted to have an independent review about whether the IRS was properly enforcing tax laws with respect to a president of the United States.
The president has publicly said that his businesses and everything are under audit, so I don't think it's any surprise to any person in the public or me or anyone else. So I don't see why I would have asked that question as it relates to the current year when he's already publicly said it, but we'll look into it and get back to you.
Senator Coons has one quick question, but before, I don't want to lose our train of thought here. I listened carefully to my good friend Senator Van Hollen, and as usual, he asks really good questions, but I want to give you another perspective. You know, the Saints lost a chance to go to the Super Bowl this year. I'm not blaming him. There was a defender for the Rams, Mr. Roby Coleman, who hit our guy, pass interference, bigger than Dallas, in front of the, the world. Didn't call it, I was upset by it. But that has nothing to do with what I'm about to ask you. I'd like to see his income taxes, just to see if he's paying his taxes. Would you share them with me?
I wasn't sure if you were asking for the referee or both
Well, how about
football
both?
players.
While we're at it, let's
All
look
right,
at
maybe
Mr.
you just
Roby
want
Coleman
them
and the
all.
referee. What kind
Maybe you can want them all so that you can find out which person you'd
Yeah,
be
I
upset at.
just want to know. That's my job, is to make sure that people pay their taxes, and I just kind of like to see their taxes. I'm a United States Senator. You can trust me. I won't leak them.
Yeah, I'd be really curious about seeing lots of people's taxes as well, but I
And
don't
I don't
have
mean
that
to
authority.
make light of this, and I know Senator Van Hollen. He's a very serious, intelligent man, and he makes very valid points. And I'm going to let him respond.
I appreciate.
But I used to collect taxes for the state of Louisiana. I was Secretary of the Department of Revenue. And people's taxes were sacrosanct. Nobody could see them. Nobody, especially, no disrespect, I'm one of you, politicians, Senator.
Well, Mr. Chairman, as you know, the referee of that game, and I happen to agree with you on the call, but come on, I mean, the referee of that game obviously doesn't oversee the commissioner of the IRS, right?
True.
Secretary of Treasury and beyond the Secretary of Treasury, the President of the United States. And that's the entire reason that the statute was put in place originally, because of that power relationship within the executive branch and Congress as an independent branch wanting to make sure that the laws are faithfully executed, would be able to verify whether or not the IRS was properly enforcing the law. So I agree with you on the call in the Saints game, but with respect, that has nothing to do with whether or not the President of the United States, whether the Congress has a right to verify whether or not the IRS is properly enforcing the law there. And we have the precedent, of course, behind the original law. We have the example of President Nixon, who stated publicly that the IRS had confirmed he had paid the taxes due and owing. And in fact, it was the joint congressional committee that determined that the IRS was wrong. So I appreciate the opportunity to say a few words. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Coons has
I just
one quick question.
I want to follow up on opportunity zones, something Senator Langford also spoke about. I was an original co-sponsor of the Investing in Opportunity Act, which helped create them. I really want to see the program succeed. I believe it can. I was disappointed that some of the transparency measures in the original bill were stripped out when it was enacted. I know in order for us to assess whether opportunity zones are succeeding, whether we need to tweak them, we need data. I think Treasury should be collecting transaction level data. Senator Bennett and I urged in a letter to you in November that you move forward on it. Thank you for your response to the letter and for issuing the RFI. I just wanted to hear a commitment that we'll work together to implement strong transaction level reporting requirements for opportunity zones so that Congress can conduct appropriate oversight and can work to make sure that opportunity zones are actually delivering the benefits for communities, which I think all of us supported in the initial drafting.
First, let me just say my understanding it was a technical issue as to why this was stripped out of the bill, not a policy issue. You have my personal assurance that first of all, we very much support opportunity zones. We think it's a very important effort that has bipartisan support, and we are fully committed to making sure we have the proper transparency on this for Congress. Now, Mr. Chairman, if I could just make one other comment, because there's been so much interest. I wish there was as much interest in IRS modernization at this committee as there is on this tax return issue. But let me just comment, I take great comfort in there are different views on this, and this is why we have a Constitution and we have a third branch of government that I'm assuming to the extent that Congress, to the extent that, first of all, we haven't made a decision, but I think you can guess which way we're leaning on our subpoena. To the extent that we don't, and there is litigation, I take great comfort that there's a third branch of government to deal with this important issue.
That's why God made federal judges. Were you done? All right. I've just got two quick questions. I don't know if there'll be questions, and then we'll get you out of here. I'm going to read from my colleague's notes here so I don't get it wrong. The IRS knows, and our commissioner's coming in a moment, but I want you to hear this, if you would, Mr. Treasurer, respectfully. The IRS knows who owes its money. And there's a list of people who owe it money. And I'm not talking about allegedly. There's a final judgment That list goes to the Bureau of the Fiscal Service. Now, that's the part of Treasury that cuts the checks. Am I right so far? All right.
Yes, you are.
The Bureau operates something known as the Federal Payment Levy Program. That cross-checks the payments to federal contractors who owe the IRS money, because we don't want to be doing business with consultants or contractors and giving them taxpayer money when they're not paying their fair share. And I'm not talking about a tax dispute. I'm talking about final judgment, you owe it. According to the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, a lot of federal agencies don't participate in the levy program. We're paying out tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars every year to consultants and contractors that owe the United States government money. And I need your help getting that straight. I'm going to get a separate meeting with you and our IRS commissioner. I'm going to ask him about this. This is low-hanging fruit. This is unconscionable. Second thing I want to point out to you quickly, I don't know if you know this, and again, you didn't birth this child, but you got to raise it. The Department of Treasury is holding on to $24 billion, not million, billion, 9 zeros, in matured, unredeemed U.S. savings bonds. Now, these are savings bonds that have matured, so interest is no longer running, and the U.S. Department of Treasury, I'm not blaming you, they've got a list of all the Americans to whom this money's owed. It's their money. It's not our money. $24 billion. And you know what we're doing to get it back to them? Nothing. Zero. Nada. Why don't we just turn that money over to the states, all of which have an unclaimed property program, and do the right thing? These are people who already, most of them are taxpayers. When they owe the government money, the government is all over them to pay. Now, government owes them money. Why don't we give it back to them? I would like you to answer that one.
Okay, well, first let me comment on, I appreciate the Inspector General's work and raising this issue to us and to you. I think it's an important issue, and you have my commitment. We will work on that with you. I think the Commissioner and I share that view. This is low-hanging fruit. Now, on the second issue of unredeemed savings bonds, and yes, I'd be happy to have a private meeting with you and your staff. I have spent time on this in preparation for this issue. So let me first say, this is not like other unclaimed property, okay? This is a federal obligation, and the federal government intends that any person who owns any of those bonds, that we will give them back their money. It is not as simple as us having a list. Some of this stuff goes back long periods of time. Some of this information is on microfiche. The cost of us going back and getting this information, and many times in a way that would be useful to find the taxpayer, would far exceed the amount of money. That in many cases, this is a couple of $100s. So one thing I would not do is go out and spend more of the federal government's money to try to find people than we owe to them. I can assure you we will work with the states, but if the money is unclaimed, our intention is, now, let me just say, in very specific situations, if my understanding someone's died without a will and things like that, in those cases, we will turn it over to the states. But I am not going to write a $24 billion check on behalf of the federal government to spend more money than to find it. But I can assure you we will work with the states in any way that is reasonable to deal with this issue.
Fair enough. You were this close to being done, and Senator Manchin came.
That's right. I like Senator Manchin.
You were
so I'm
this
glad-
close.
No, I'm glad he's here, and we have the opportunity to answer some of his questions. I always look forward to that.
Senator Manchin.
You've missed a lot of questions around the president's tax return. So I'm just going to say, if you want to talk about the IRS modernization, I'd really look forward to that.
Talk about the CFIUS, and I know that we've talked about that before. I'm familiar with the many illegal actions that foreign countries and companies take to undercut our economic infrastructure, such as stealing trade secrets, hacking our computer systems, but I've always been concerned about the attempts from foreign companies to make illegal investments and gain control. I think you and I might have talked one time or so about this before, so my question would be, do you believe that CFIUS should require reviews of all foreign investments in the American Stock Exchange?
I'm sorry, could you just repeat the end, CFIUS?
Do you believe that CFIUS should require reviews of all foreign investments in American stock exchanges?
First of all, I very much appreciate what has been the bipartisan support on CFIUS and the updated FIRMA legislation. I also appreciate this committee looking at, we need money to do this. I don't want to make a specific answer on any specific, it would be unfair for me to comment on any specific industry or anything else, but I will tell you, I personally spend a lot of time on this. These things all come to me to sign, and you know, it is likely if there was an acquisition, as you've described, that would be subject to CFIUS jurisdiction.
I'm going to give you one example, and that's all. I won't elaborate on it. You know, with the new the drilling that we're doing, fracking in the Marcellus, Utica Shale, and Appalachia. West Virginia and Appalachia has an ocean of energy under it. A lot of it has wet properties, which is butane, propane, and ethane. Those are building stocks for manufacturing. We don't have any CFIUS review on, I mean, you know, we've had CFIUS review on export of oil or natural gas, LNG, but not on these products. These products, if a country such as China can buy every drop, which they're after, of our wet properties and have control of that stock stream, if you will, it takes us out of the ability to have manufacturing back in Appalachia or back in America because the building blocks are gone. So I'm saying I've got a piece of legislation, which I'm sure I'd love to sit down with you and your staff to see if you think that that falls in the purview and it would be something you all could support. I'm just saying a review, just a review of the products that are leaving our country that prevent us from having the economic vitality and manufacturing base that we had.
It sounds like a very good idea, and I welcome the opportunity to sit down with you and go through that. So thank you for bringing that up.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm quick. I'm glad Secretary's here and a few things, but this CFIA things is really personal, and it's going to hurt us, and we'd love to. Whoever I can sit on your staff,
You have our commitment. We will follow up this afternoon
We'll
and figure out a meeting.
We have a bill, and once you look at the bill, and then we'll tell you our purpose. Okay. Thank you very much.
Everybody else cool? We're all cool. Mr. Secretary, thank you. Thank you for your good work. If you're with the Secretary today on his team, raise your hand, please. It's okay. Thank you for your good work, too. Okay? Thank you all. Appreciate your time, Mr. Secretary. Is our commissioner here? And we got to be nice to him. I'm okay.
It's good to see you.
All right, the subcommittee meeting will come back to order for our second panel. We have with us today Internal Revenue Service Commissioner Chuck Rettig. The commissioner was sworn in on October 1, 2018. He is our 49th commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. He previously was in private practice of law for 36 years in Beverly Hills, California. He's represented in that capacity thousands of individuals and businesses before the IRS, so he's seen it from both sides. He's represented clients before the Department of Justice Tax Division, federal court, state taxing authorities. He has a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of California at Los Angeles. He has a JD from Pepperdine, and he has an LLM in taxation from NYU. Can't do much better than that. It's a tough program. I am going to forego my opening statement and ask the commissioner if he wouldn't mind going forward with his testimony, and then we'll ask questions. Is that okay, Mr. Commissioner? Welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Chairman Kennedy, Ranking Member Coons, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the IRS budget and the 2019 tax filing season. I'm truly honored to serve as the 49th Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. Having spent more than 36 years in the private sector representing taxpayers before the Internal Revenue Service, I understand how important a fully functioning IRS is to the overall success of our country. Our people interact with more Americans than any other institution, public or private. Our people make a difference, they care, and they take pride in serving the taxpayers and our country. The IRS is important to every American, and every American is important to the IRS. I'm passionate about modernizing our information technology infrastructure and continuing to improve cybersecurity. I'm passionate about making sure our workforce receives the resources and training they need to appropriately serve the taxpayer community. We want to do more, and with your assistance, we will be better able to enhance the overall taxpayer experience. I'm passionate about helping all taxpayers with their filing and reporting obligations, but especially those in the underserved and English as a second language communities. Taxpayers who are willing to comply must receive appropriate levels of support and timely guidance while we respect their rights and forever safeguard their information. And I'm passionate about making sure we enforce the tax laws. A robust enforcement effort assures compliant taxpayers that those who fail to comply risk the consequences of such noncompliance. I'm pleased to report that the 2019 filing season opened on time on January 28 and has gone well. As of May 3, the IRS has received more than 141 million individual returns, and we have issued more than 100 million refunds for a total of more than $274 billion. The fact that the filing season has gone so well is a tribute to IRS employees who have a long history of rising to all types of challenges, demonstrating the strength of dedication to our mission, which should enhance the respect and confidence of every American. I'm extremely proud of each and every employee at the Internal Revenue Service. Turning to the President's budget request, we are asking for an appropriation of $11.472 billion for the IRS in fiscal year 2020. This is $170 million, or 1.5% above the 2019 enacted level. The request proposes increasing funding in several critical areas. At the top of that list is technology modernization. In April, we issued our integrated modernization business plan, which will cost about $2.3 to $2.7 billion over 6 years to help bring our critical IT systems up to date. The President's budget request includes $290 million in initial funding for our plan. The integrity of the nation's voluntary tax compliance system depends on a modernized IRS and a modernized infrastructure, and we look forward to working with Congress to implement this plan. Another critical area where we propose to increase funding involves the IRS's ongoing efforts to secure our systems and protect taxpayer data. Technology has greatly helped the IRS protect our computer systems from cyber attacks. It has also helped us in our ongoing battle to protect taxpayers and their information against tax-related identity theft. The funding called for in the President's budget is also important to our efforts to maintain a well-trained workforce. This is a critical time for us, given that a large percentage of our workforce is either eligible to retire or will become eligible to retire within the next 2 years. We must hire and train new employees before our most seasoned ones retire, and we lose the ability to pass on their knowledge and experience to the next generation. To help us further in this arena, we are asking Congress to restore Streamlined Critical Pay Authority, which expired in 2013. Without this authority, we are losing highly qualified candidates to other organizations that can hire them more quickly. Chairman Kennedy, Ranking Member Coons, and members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the dedication and support that you have shown to the IRS mission. I am committed to working with you to ensure the IRS can continue to fulfill its mission now and in the years to come. That concludes my statement, and I would be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. I've got a couple to start. Look, everybody ought to pay their taxes. If somebody didn't pay their taxes, that means the rest of us have to pick up their share. And that's not right, and that's not fair. And it also undermines the integrity of the tax system. I know it takes money to run your agency and to collect those taxes. I want to talk about return on investment. I'm just picking a figure out of the air. Let's suppose that the United States Congress appropriated to you $100 million to hire auditors and support staff. So $100 million outlay right now. Now, of course, that will be continuing. What kind of return will we get?
Looking strictly at numbers, and before we get into sort of marginal issues that come with hiring and efficiencies associated with hiring, the typical numbers that we hear are between 5 to 8 to 1. But those are actually the more hard numbers, $1 of collection associated with the actual efforts. The number that's more difficult to quantify is the deterrent effect. The IRS...
I'm sorry, the what?
The deterrent effect.
Yes.
The IRS essentially, if we're in every neighborhood, which is where we want to be, we want to do more. And if we're in every neighborhood with a visible presence, there's a deterrent effect associated with that. Similarly, if we're not in every neighborhood, neighborhoods being different types of tax issues, et cetera, if we're not enforcing and touching issues, that deterrent effect gets lessened. And presently, we're dealing with about an 83% voluntary compliance rate, which is great in terms of an industrialized country, but if you turn it around, it's about a 17% non-compliance rate. By having a visible, respected Internal Revenue Service, I think that the voluntary compliance rate would theoretically go up. If the IRS was not as respected, theoretically the voluntary compliance rate would go down. Each 1%, if we went up 1%, that's about $36 billion a year without enforced collection. If we dropped 1% through a series where people might not respect us as much, that's a drop of $36 billion, and obviously a 2% swing is about $70+ billion per year. So I'm a huge believer in enforcement. I'm a huge believer in taxpayer service. I believe that the taxpayers who are undergoing an effort to try to get it right, to try to get their filings right, need our assistance, they need our guidance, they need to be able to call us on the phone, have us answer the phone, talk to them, interact with them. And similarly, I'm a believer in the enforcement side, and being out in the neighborhoods, we are taking a very hard look at that, and I'm very focused on those two issues.
If we provided extra money for enforcement and service, which is equally important, would the agency just quietly shift it over to operations?
I'm not a believer in shipping funds from enforcement to operations at the present time. I'm a believer in enforcement. Some of the way that our accounting works, some of the figures that end up under an operations title are actually on the enforcement side, such as IT for the enforcement side of the house gets logged in on the operations side. And so, depending upon how you do that. But I'm also a huge believer in having well-trained personnel, the ones answering the phones for taxpayers who want to get.
I agree. Excuse me for interrupting, but I've got a couple more right quick. I want some comfort on the IRS technology modernization. Now, we both know the history. A lot of money's been wasted. And I know McKinsey has blessed your new effort. They didn't guarantee it, though. First, I'd like to get a copy. I don't think we have a copy of the McKinsey report, do we? I'd like to get a copy of the McKinsey blessing. Number two, why is this time going to be different?
The IRS, I am aware of the history of the IRS with respect to IT efforts, and certainly the agency's very sensitive to those issues. But we should also look at the fact that we had a very successful implementation of the TCJA that started about a year ago, before December of 2017. Our folks started, implemented. We had a very successful filing season. We had a historic high in terms of hourly processing of tax returns, as well as per second, processed 536 tax returns per second. So on the IT side of the house, we've pulled forward. On the plan itself, we have a lot of specifics in there in terms of oversight, stages, milestones, meeting milestones before we go into a next stage, which was different. It's also focused on the business divisions, much more so than just strictly an IT plan. It's a integrated business plan, if you will, which I think is different, and also more than willing to come up as often as possible to meet with you and your staff and others to walk through the specifics of it. It includes oversight on an ongoing basis by independent contractors and also outsiders. It also includes our oversight by Congress, and we would look forward to that.
If we do it, I'd like you to, as part of this effort, to designate who is responsible for each different aspect of it. I mean, like, really who? What person with a beating heart, if something goes wrong, can we call and say, what in God's name happened here?
Yeah, ultimately, Senator, I'm the commissioner, and I'm
Well, I
ultimately
understand,
responsible.
but you won't be commissioner forever.
The individuals will be very well known to your staff and to others.
Great. Commissioner, I'm sorry, Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Commissioner. Let me start by agreeing with the chairman's opening comments that we need to make sure everybody pays the taxes that are due or owing, and everybody who doesn't means the rest of us are picking up the tab. So I support your efforts to strengthen tax compliance. Let me just follow up with a couple of questions that I asked Secretary Mnuchin with respect to the automatic audit procedures that are in place at the IRS with respect to presidential tax returns. I think you probably know the history here when we learned that President Nixon had not paid the taxes that he owed, even though the IRS had signed off on his taxes. We put in place an automatic audit procedure. So my question is, if a person becomes president while they're being audited for tax returns from earlier years, does the IRS's automatic presidential audit procedure also include the prior tax returns for that president?
The audit procedures of the Internal Revenue Service pick up open years, tend to pick up open years, and so those procedures should apply.
So I'm referring specifically here to the automatic audit procedures that apply to the President and the Vice President of the United States. So you're testifying that that special automatic procedure would apply to prior year returns of those individuals if they'd been under audit in the prior years.
Yes, sir, that's my understanding.
Are you sure of that? Is that the way this is being implemented at the IRS?
I'm not personally involved in the examination of any individual taxpayer as commissioner.
I understand that.
No.
What I'm asking you is what the process. I'm not asking you about any individual taxpayer. I'm asking you as the commissioner of the IRS, is that the way the manual is implemented with respect to the automatic presidential audit?
Yes, and we are willing to come up and sit with you and your staff and provide significant details in terms of the manual provisions and how it works with respect to those
Right, no, I see the manual, and there's, as you may know, some ambiguity here, and there's some lack of clarity. Well, let me ask you this with respect to clarity. Does the automatic IRS audit include a review of all of a president's underlying business enterprises?
Again, it would be the same. The process of examining a president, the manual provisions provide that the president and vice president would be audited, and the process of auditing any taxpayer, including a president and vice president, should pick up the entities that that person is related to. Whether the depth of examination of a particular entity would depend upon the judgment and skill of the examiners as to whether they believe there are issues there, and how they would move on. The examiners make those decisions subject to a group manager, et cetera, and up in the for those and in the ordinary case.
But you would agree to make sure that an individual, in this case the president or the vice president, is paying the taxes due and owing. You would have to look at all those business enterprises, right?
Sir, myself and literally every employee that I've interacted with the Internal Revenue Service in the first 7.5 months take our responsibilities seriously. The career employees are career employees because they...
I'm not suggesting otherwise. What I'm asking is whether that is part of the automatic procedure as applied. Because you wrote in Forbes back in 2016, you wrote an article, and I just want to quote from that article. For wealthy individuals, individual tax returns sometimes only provide a brief financial overview linked to numerous other conclusions and entities. To fully understand the financial status of Trump, one would likely need to see returns for multiple years, the work papers for the individual returns, and the returns for numerous related entities. I take it you still agree with that statement?
It's no different than what I've just testified to, sir.
And my question is, are you confident, because it's not clear in the manual, that the individuals reviewing the returns of the president, the vice president, and others covered by automatic audits are looking into all of the underlying business enterprises?
Senator, our people would come up and give you a detailed briefing on exactly the process involved. For privacy and confidentiality provisions, I should not be discussing issues with respect to any particular taxpayer, whether it's a president, a vice president, or some other taxpayer. And so on that, generically, when they get into an examination, I'm confident that the examiners look into everything. That's correct.
And just to conclude, Mr. Chairman, I think the precedent here, again, the precedent going back to the original purpose for the provisions where Congress is requesting the opportunity and the ability to verify this work is exactly for the kind of reasons we're talking about here. I mean, these are in-depth issues, and it seems, given the past history and the reasons for this law, Congress has an interest as a separate branch of government in verifying, in independently verifying that all these procedures are being pursued with respect to senior members of the executive branch. So I thank you. I thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
Thank you, Senator.
Our people remain willing to meet. If someone would take us up on the offer, we remain willing to meet with staff or senators or whoever to walk through the procedures. And I think, like myself, you would gain a high degree of confidence in the capabilities of our people.
I would just say, Mr. Commissioner, the IRS, President Nixon stated that the IRS had signed off on his tax returns, and in fact, the IRS had signed off on his tax returns. It was later revealed that he owed another $400,000 plus.
I would suggest somebody meet with our IRS people currently.
The issue is,
I'm not discounting what you're saying, Senator.
I understand. I just think that given the history here and given the history of the statute, Congress has indicated a legitimate interest in having an independent review when we're talking about senior executive branch officials.
And if I may?
Thank you, Commissioner. let's go to Senator Langford, and then we're going to go to Senator Coons.
Thanks. Let me run through a couple things. Tax gap. We've asked for an update on tax gap. It's a decade old at this point. Where are we at this point on trying to get an update?
The updated tax gap will be for 2011 to 2013. The information should be forthcoming, and we should be releasing it in either June or July of this year.
Great. That'd be very helpful. Senator Coons and I have been on the issue about nonprofits and how they're affected. It's an unanswered question for the tax change that happened in 2018 about how that will affect nonprofit giving. Typically, when we go back and ask for nonprofit records and where things are as far as giving record, not for individuals or for individual charities, but for percentages, it's usually 3 or 4 years old. This is a case where we're going to need records as quickly as we can get them to try to get estimates of what's happened on charitable giving, because there were significant changes in that structure, as you know, for 2018. How quickly can we get a good estimate of nonprofit and charitable giving totals and compare them to previous years for the 2018 year?
I believe that I issued a letter to you, if I'm not mistaken, on this point, and I think Senator Coons got it as well, that we're sensitive to the issue, we're sensitive to the desire to get the information. I think that in my letter I indicated that it should be forthcoming in July or August and that we would continue to update. But the one issue is taxpayers who do not itemize.
Right.
We would not be able to pull information from them.
Sure, and that's.
But the rest we should.
We're just trying to get a best ballpark to be able to try to figure what happened last year, previous years, and to be able to get an eyeball on it, to be able to just see. Thank you for that. We'll look forward to getting a chance to be able to go through that and review it. You had made a comment in your testimony about requiring a Social Security number for certain tax credits. And it just made a policy recommendation there, or just an idea. Obviously, that would require action, I assume, on Finance Committee to be able to make corrections on that. You want to help provide even greater clarity for that?
It kind of relates to the tax gap. A big part of the tax gap is our difficulty in matching information, receiving certain information electronically, and the ability to coordinate that. And then if we get it electronically, we can actually process it a lot quicker than if we get it in a paper or other form, or we have to manually input information. So issues like Social Security numbers, issues like electronic filing with respect to W-2s, there's a number of items pending that would help us and help the country really process returns quicker. Obviously, I think a higher degree of accuracy if we can electronically move things through our systems rather than having to have people input.
Right. Same thing you mentioned on student loans, that you're asking for greater ability with the Department of Education and IRS to be able to cooperate together. What is missing at this point so that student loan processing can go faster and oversight can go faster?
I'll have to get back to you specifically on that. We have people working on it, and it's just not one that I'm directly aware of.
Great. No, want to be able to help correct that. You also mentioned hiring authority. You want to provide some greater clarity for what is needed for IRS and hiring authority. That's a committee that I work particularly with.
What's pending is the ability for us to get what's referred to as streamlined critical pay, which accelerates the onboarding process. It's a higher salary, but critical to us is the onboarding process for IT and cybersecurity experts. We need cybersecurity experts. We need everybody with respect to the IT and in our modernization. And the more standard onboarding process for the federal government, including the Internal Revenue Service, is a 6 to 8 month window. Streamlined critical pay would allow us essentially to get people on board within about 45 days. And in those arenas, people who are looking for positions in IT or cyber are not going to wait 6 to 8 months to come to work for the Internal Revenue Service.
Right.
So it's an accelerant for the onboarding process for people. And, you know, there are people who are willing to come in and have a patriotic desire to work with us. They understand what we're all about. But a 6 to 8 month process is difficult. And as one example, there's, my understanding, there's 300,000 cyber positions available in this country with a 0% unemployment rate.
Right.
And we receive about 1.4 billion attacks a year on our system. And so this is critical to security of the data that we are protecting.
Okay, thank you for that. We'll continue to be able to work on that. I'm going to make one quick comment, and this is one that you're going to inherit as it comes through, and we'll pass on to the next generation in the days ahead. And I'm just going to raise to you because we'll bring it up at other moments as well. I've worked for years, and with the previous administration, had multiple conversations with Commerce and with IRS Every 10 years, we spend $14 billion on doing a census. $14 billion. Now, your total budget is $11.5 billion, basically for everything that you do, touching every single person in the country. We touch every single person in the country with the census for $14 billion. There's not been cooperation, as you shared before. If we can do that with education, that would help on our student loan processing. There's not been cooperation between IRS and Treasury and Commerce on the census. You touch everyone every single year. Commerce does that every 10 years. I think there's some synergy that can be gained there. This is an area that I'll come back and we'll visit about more. I just want to be able to raise. I'm not talking about for 2020. It's a little late in the game for that. It wasn't when I brought it up years ago, but it is now. But I'd like for us to look out on the horizon and see if maybe we can't save $4 or $5 billion in the next census time by getting some synergy together between the IRS and between Commerce and see if we can help in this process. So I appreciate that. We'll talk about that more in the days ahead. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Thank you, Senator Coons.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner. Just want to ask you some questions about enforcement and tax gap and workforce, if I can. The tax gap, if I remember correctly here, is estimated about $400 billion. I think you said it earlier that a 1% increase in voluntary compliance would generate roughly $36 billion. My math may not be the best, but that means just about a $400 billion tax gap. And it doesn't address the extent to which foreign tax evasion, American sheltering income in foreign accounts contributes to that gap. Do you think the definition of the tax gap should be adjusted to include foreign tax evasion? And some of my colleagues have blamed the tax gap entirely on tax credits like the Earned Income Tax Credit, which I think overstates the case. My impression is tax credits like the EITC are at most 10% of the tax gap. Is that accurate? What's your sense of the contribution of tax credits to the tax gap?
Well, the EITC improper payment is about $18 billion a year. You know, the remaining issues of the tax gap are spread throughout a lot of different issues. There's a tax gap map, which the last map that's available is tax years 2008 to 2010. The net annual tax gap all across all issues is about $406 billion. The gross is about $458 billion per year.
Right. Would you agree we might benefit from redefining it to also include foreign tax evasion?
Senator, we are looking really hard at the tax gap and what comprises it. We actually have a group that's looking at the, I challenged a group to ignore what they've been doing in the past and using data analytics and everything. What would it look like today if you were to look at it? And one thing that people need to understand is going back in history, the tax gap was formulated around a time where most people filed their returns in paper. And so the information available was different. Also, the economy used to be different with respect to whether people used cash or people used credit cards. Items like Bitcoin did not exist. Right. So we're in a different time. The current tax gap map that's coming out will be 2011 to 2013. It will be, it's done essentially in the traditional manner. But we've challenged people. We want to know what it is. We want to know each of the individual arenas. I look at it as sort of as not just a tax gap, but an enforcement map. You know, where would you deploy the resources that we do have for the most significant impact? Not like we're going to ignore other areas. I'm a big believer that we need to touch everyone and we need to touch every issue. But where we would deploy maybe more skilled resources, I think the tax gap is a good map for that. I just don't have confidence in a map that's, I don't have a high degree of confidence in a map that's done on a paper system when we're no longer in a paper system. Right. I need to look the next 5 years ahead, not 10 years back.
I was encouraged, you requested increased funding for enforcement activities, but I was concerned that it's predicated on receiving a cap adjustment. Why not just include a robust request for enforcement activities in your base budget? Why make it conditional on a cap adjustment that last year, same scenario, requested a cap adjustment, didn't get it? Your budget says that $360 million investment in additional enforcement could generate as much as $47 billion in additional revenue at a time when we're seeing growing deficits. That struck me as a worthwhile investment. Why not just put forward a more robust enforcement proposal in your base budget?
Our position is that we could operate within the president's budget. The cap would actually, I'm a big believer in trying to get us that 362 million, of which 200 million is enforcement, and the balance is on operations side. And if you heard what I mentioned before, the contingent of that operations is actually to serve the enforcement side of the house. It's not like administrative overhead.
Right.
And I'm also a believer that we should be reporting, what part of that is on the enforcement side. And I think that maybe people would realize that we need to go there more so than if it gets buried on the, my terminology would be admin side.
I look forward to working with you on that, because I think generating more revenue
Available to me
from
with
folks
everybody.
who should be paying their taxes is appropriate. Let me talk to you about Taxpayer Services. Your budget requests a cut of 90 million for Taxpayer Services, about 4%. That means the telephone level of service, FY 2020, would be about 68%, or about 1 in 3 taxpayers would never reach a live service person. My concern is that the IRS just doesn't have the resources it needs to provide services to taxpayers. You are the one federal agency that virtually every one of our constituents contacts at some point, has some interaction with. Back in 2004, the IRS answered nearly 90% of telephone calls. The average person waited 2.5 minutes. What are we going to do to return to that level of service? My concern is we're $1 billion shy of what was the IRS funding just around the time that I became a senator. We've gradually starved it down to a place where you've got very frustrated taxpayers waiting, in some cases indefinitely. I recognize we're investing huge amounts in IT modernization to move towards, most of us are doing mobile banking now. I look forward to the day when the IRS can connect with taxpayers electronically. Can you give me any sense on what timeline every taxpayer will be able to get a meaningful answer via the internet? And why not invest more rather than cut in taxpayer services?
A significant part of the modernization plan is devoted to taxpayer services and various digital options. We have a significant part of the country doesn't have broadband service, and so we need to retain our ability to interact with people on the phone, in person, have them walk in through a taxpayer assistance center, or also the ability where we might not have a taxpayer assistance center, be able to provide some type of virtual connection to us for maybe the more remote areas. And so we're hugely sensitive to that. Ultimately, we come down to a bit of a guns and butter determination. We're left with so many dollars, how we allocate those dollars. I've said that I'm an enforcement guy. I'm a big believer in enforcement. I believe that enforcement supports the taxpayers who are trying to comply and give their best. I also believe that we need to be in the communities where taxpayers don't have representation. So the underserved communities, the English as a second language communities, we need to provide all the options that they get in the retail world, such as banking on your cell phone. We should be accessible to them in that manner. Another arena is we presently provide forms and certain services in 6 different languages. I think that our country has somewhere on the order of 120 plus different languages. I think to get the respect of the taxpayers in a lot of the communities who are fully able and capable of living in a community in this country, proudly so, without the ability to speak English, to gain the respect of those communities, I believe that we need to get into those communities and deliver services in their language. So I think you're going to see a big movement for us in that direction. Literally every employee of the Internal Revenue Service has heard me reach out and make that a top priority. The language issue, the underserved issue. I had the good fortune of, they call it double jacking, being on telephones in Kansas City, Atlanta, and Austin with taxpayers who call in who have an issue. And the issue can be in any language the person has, and the IRS person needs to respond to that. It can be any issue the person has, and the IRS person needs to respond to that. And I wanted to have a firsthand look and interaction on that to see how we're doing. I had no knowledge of that, no interaction with that on the outside. And I can say that I think every American can be hugely proud of our people who answer these calls. They're doing spectacular, and I was really, really proud.
Quick last question, correctable error authority. Your budget requests that. It's something I'm familiar with from previous hearings. The concern I think most of us would have is just what's the recourse? I recognize the improvement where there's just an obvious single digit, but what kind of recourse will individual taxpayers have if the IRS adjustments are erroneous? And how do we avoid a place where folks are caught in a sort of bureaucratic red tape mess if the IRS exercises that correctable error authority, and then folks are coming to us saying it was done in error?
Briefly, Mr. Commissioner.
Pardon me?
Briefly, if you could.
I'll work on the briefly part.
That's okay.
Without correctable error authority, we make the adjustment and the taxpayer is pushed into the administrative system where they might have a deficiency determination and need, or an outright examination and kind of go through the exam appeals. And, you know, if they desired the litigation angle on the issue, which is really unfair to a taxpayer. I look at correctable error authority as a service to the taxpayer. It allows us to get it right. Those correctable errors are based upon information that's otherwise in our system or in another federal government system, such as maybe it's a typo, a matching issue. And so if we have a W-2 or we have a 1099 and they picked up a different number, it allows us to insert that without having to push the taxpayer into the administrative stream. So I think the ability to accelerate a resolution of their matter is significant with correctable error as opposed to what we're stuck doing now.
I'm interested in it. Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your
You bet.
tolerance of my multiple
Thank you,
commitments
sir.
this morning.
You bet.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
I've just got a couple more, Mr. Commissioner. I'm a member of the United States Senate. Part of my job is to make sure the Internal Revenue Service is operating properly and that you're properly collecting taxes. So as part of my job, I'm going to ask you to send me a copy of the tax returns for everybody in my neighborhood back home. You can trust me. I just want to see them, make sure everybody's up to snuff. Why is that a bad idea?
Sir, the voluntary compliance rate that I referenced before is taxpayers who voluntarily file and pay the amount that is appropriate, and that's about 83%. In significant part, it's based upon the integrity and the respect that the Internal Revenue Service does have with the majority.
Yeah, but I'm a member of the U.S. Senate. It's okay.
Every taxpayer has a concern of the privacy and confidential nature of their tax return and tax return information, and it's our duty to responsibly handle that. And if we violate that duty, the voluntary compliance rate in the country is at risk.
Can we agree that the American people would lose much confidence that they have in the even-handedness of our tax collection system if they knew politicians, let me use a less pejorative term, elected officials could get a copy of their tax returns?
I believe that the American taxpayers take great pride in the fact that the information they provide to the Internal Revenue Service is private. And
Now, how many members are you on your staff at the IRS? How many employees do you have?
their total employee staff is about 80,000.
80,000, okay. Can each one of those 80,000 people just kind of wander in and look at people's tax returns?
No,
You have a carefully selective group, don't you?
we do.
Why is that?
Same reason, protect the integrity of the service, which is to protect the confidentiality and privacy of return information for each person and taxpayer.
Okay, let me shift gears. I take it from your testimony, if I talk about improper payments, we're on the same wavelength. We have, as you know, about $144 billion a year in improper payments. That's 9 zeros. I'm not blaming it on you. And I know we'll never get that down to zero, but there's some low-hanging fruit there. We keep paying dead people. Now, I've seen dead people vote, but when they start cashing checks, I mean, there's obviously some fraud there. Why can't we stop that?
Senator, we've actually done incredibly well over the last 3 years with respect to identity fraud, identity theft, stolen identity theft, tax return-related fraud, in significant part with a security summit involving outside software providers who've had ideas. We've had about a 71% reduction in ID theft from 2015 to 2018.
But, excuse me for interrupting, but doesn't the Social Security have a master death file?
I believe that's correct.
Does everybody use it?
That I don't have personal knowledge.
They don't. They don't. And in fact, I'll apologize later if I'm wrong, but I don't think Social Security shares it with everybody. I think their policy for some people is we can't, in government, we can't show it to you. You're getting a note there. You want to stop and read it?
The IRS marks the taxpayer account when the Social Security adds to the master file.
Okay. Well, other agencies don't. And we're paying dead people. And I've seen, I mean, I've done the analysis on this. I've seen bill after bill after bill passed, and it doesn't get any better. And I understand how hard it is to get that down to zero, but couldn't we start with the low-hanging fruit? I want to get an appointment with you and visit about this. I mean, paying dead people is a bridge too far. Number two, unpaid taxes. Federal government does a lot of business with fine men and women as consultants and contractors, but some of them owe us taxes. And I don't mean allegedly owe us taxes. I mean, there's a final judgment. They owe us taxes. And there's a list at Treasury that says these folks owe us taxes. Don't contract with them, or if you do contract with them, get our money before you pay them. Why aren't we doing a better job there?
So, Senator, we do a good job with respect to contractors who are paid through the Bureau of Fiscal Services. We can actually levy on the income stream to the
Yeah,
contractor.
but not all the agencies participate
That's
in the levy
correct.
program.
And that's where the issue is.
Can you get me a list of every agency that doesn't participate in the levy program?
We'll reach back and see what we can provide for you.
I need that list.
Because without payment through BFS, we're required to issue individual levies on a continuing basis.
Well, I'm not going to blame it on you, but I want a list of every agency that doesn't participate in the levy program.
We take the issue seriously.
I know you do.
I came on board to make a difference, and these kinds of issues are really of significance to me.
Now, everybody around this place, I'm not talking about your place, my place, talks about how we need to spend taxpayer money more carefully. I do it too. And everybody around this place talks about the $22 trillion debt. And everybody around this place talks about we need to reduce our spending. But you know what it's like? It's like everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody's ready to make the trip. We never get around to it. Now, this is low-hanging fruit. I'm not fussing at you. Senator Coons knows what I'm talking about here. He agrees, I bet. I don't mean to speak for him, but this is low-hanging fruit. This is paying dead people and giving taxpayer money to vendors. I'm not saying they're not qualified, who owe us money, who owe the American people money. My God, we ought to be able to solve that. I want your help. I'm impressed with your work. I think you're doing a great job. I think your heart's in the right place. You got a good staff. If you're on the commissioner's staff, raise your hand. Thank you for your good work. But I need your help getting this straight.
Thank you, and thank you for the nice comments about our employees. Our employees work
I know they
really
do.
hard.
I know they do. Anything else?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you to the folks who work hard to make sure that we collect the revenue that's owed to the people of the United States so that we've got the funding to deliver the services for the people of the United States. And, Mr. Chairman, it is a delight to hear your questioning and to work with you in the coming months. I think will be quite productive. When someone comes to their service in Congress with detailed previous experience in an area like Treasury, revenue collections, it is a welcome moment because not all of us come with that background. And so I've enjoyed this hearing. I appreciate your service, and I look forward to our next one. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Mr. Commissioner. The hearing record will remain open until next Wednesday. For subcommittee members who wish to submit any statements or questions for the record, thank you, Mr. Commissioner, for your time today.
Thank you for your time. Appreciate it, Senator.
Hearing's adjourned.